Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. My name is Aris, and I used to be a veterinarian. I worked in a busy clinic in Reykjavik for almost a decade. The noise, the traffic, the constant pressure, it was a lot, but it was a life. That life ended the day I lost my wife, Elena, in a car accident just outside the city. After that, the noise of the city became unbearable. Every car horn, every siren was a ghost. I needed silence. I craved it. So I took what little we had saved and bought a small, remote sheep farm on the west coast of Iceland, nestled in a fjord that was empty save for a few abandoned houses. The previous owner, an old man named Jorn, had passed away. His nephew, who sold me the place, seemed relieved to be rid of it. He told me the sheep were a unique, hardy breed. They mostly take care of themselves, he'd said with a shrug. The farm was beautiful in a stark, brutal kind of way. A small, turf-roofed house, a sturdy barn, and about 50 acres of rocky pasture that ran right down to the black sand of the fjord. And then there were the sheep. They were smaller than typical Icelandic sheep, with thick, shaggy wool the color of wet stone. And the first odd thing I noticed was their silence. I've been around livestock my whole life. They make noise. They bleat when they're hungry, when they're scared, when they're just being sheep. But these were quiet, utterly, unnervingly silent. They moved like a single, gray cloud across the landscape, their hooves making soft thuds on the turf, but never a single sound from their throats. I chalked it up to the breed, another quirk of this isolated place. The silence was what I'd come for, after all. In Jorn's house, I found his old journals. Most entries were about the weather, lambing season, fixing fences, standard farm stuff. But a few rules were written on the inside cover, stark and clear. 1. Count the flock at dusk, always 54. 2. Never leave the north gate open after dark. 3. They are never to be brought inside. Not for any reason. I followed the rules. Every evening, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, I'd count them. 54 gray shapes grazing peacefully. The silence of the farm began to work its magic. The sharp edges of my grief started to soften. The quiet wasn't empty, it was filled with the wind, the cry of gulls, the distant groan of glacial ice. It was a healing quiet. Then winter came, and in Iceland, winter is not a season, it's a siege. The wind became a physical force, a thing that clawed at the little house. The snow fell in blinding, horizontal sheets. One afternoon, a blizzard blew in with shocking speed. The sky and the land merged into a single swirling whiteness. I'd managed to get the sheep into the barn, except for one. A lamb, born late in the season, had been separated from its mother and was huddled against a stone wall, already half buried in a drift. I couldn't leave it. It would be dead in an hour. Jorn's third rule echoed in my head, never to be brought inside. But it was just superstition, wasn't it? The ramblings of an old man driven mad by solitude. I was a vet, a man of science. I couldn't let an animal freeze to death because of a silly rule. I scooped up the lamb. It was cold, shivering, but it didn't make a sound. It just looked at me with those dark, glassy eyes. I carried it into the house, into the warmth of my small kitchen. I laid it on a blanket by the peat stove and went to make it some warm milk. That's when the silence changed. Before, it had been a natural silence. The absence of man made noise. Now it was a presence. A heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all sound. The crackle of the fire in the stove seemed distant, muffled. The howl of the wind outside was gone. It was like the house had been plunged deep underwater. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and the sound of my own breathing. The lamb stood up on the blanket. It wasn't shivering anymore. It just stood there, perfectly still, and stared at me. Its eyes weren't like sheep's eyes. They weren't vacant or animalistic. They were intelligent, aware, and they were fixed on me. I felt a prickle of unease. Just a lamb, I told myself, my voice sounding thin and alien in the crushing quiet. I offered it the bottle of milk. It ignored it, its gaze unwavering. I sat at my small kitchen table, trying to read one of Jorn's books, but I couldn't concentrate. I felt the lamb's eyes on me constantly. The silence in the house grew deeper, heavier, until it felt like a physical weight on my chest. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, coming from the direction of the barn. A soft, mournful sound. It wasn't a bleat. I know what a sheep sounds like. This was different. It was a human sound. It was the sound of someone sobbing. A deep, racking grief that I knew all too well, because it was the sound I made, alone in my car, after I'd identified Alina's body. It was a perfect mimicry of my own sorrow. I froze, the book slipping from my fingers. The lamb in the kitchen hadn't moved. It was still staring at me, its expression unreadable. The sobbing from the barn grew louder, multiplied. It wasn't one person crying anymore. It was a chorus. Dozens of voices, all weeping with my exact cadence, my exact pain. It was the sound of my deepest, most private agony, broadcasted from the barn for the whole empty shore to hear. It was the flock, the silent herd. They had found their voice, and they were using mine. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. This was wrong. This was a violation. They had taken my grief, the last sacred piece of Alina I had left, and turned it into this grotesque mockery. I scrambled to my feet, knocking over my chair. I had to get the lamb out, now. I grabbed the blanket, bundling the still staring lamb inside it. It was unnaturally calm, unnervingly heavy. I fumbled with the latch on the front door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work it. The wind and snow hit me like a physical blow, but it was a relief from the suffocating silence of the house. The chorus of my own sobs was deafening now, a symphony of despair coming from the barn. I couldn't see it through the snow, but I knew all 53 of them were in there, their heads raised, perfectly replicating a sound they should never have been able to make. I ran, stumbling through the deepening snow towards the barn. I had to put the lamb back. I had to make it stop. I reached the barn door and slid it open, just enough to shove the lamb inside. It landed softly in the hay and trotted off into the darkness without a backward glance. The moment it was inside, the sobbing stopped, instantly. The world was silent again, save for the howl of the blizzard. I didn't go back to the house. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night in my truck, the engine running for warmth, my mind reeling. The next morning, when the storm had passed, I walked out to the barn. The door was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. I counted the sheep. They were all there, grazing silently on the hay inside. 54. I sold the farm a week later, for half of what I paid for it. I didn't tell the new owner about Jorn's rules, or about the sounds. I just told him the isolation was too much for me. I moved back to the city. The noise doesn't bother me anymore. I welcome it. It's the silence I can't stand. Because sometimes, late at night, when the city finally grows quiet, I can still hear it. That soft, mournful sound. The sound of a flock of sheep, weeping with my sorrow. They took my grief, you see, and I don't think they ever gave it back. My Grandma Addie's farmhouse was my favorite place on earth, tucked away in a misty fold of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. It was a place of honeysuckles and lightning bugs, of creaking porch swings and the smell of baking bread. When she passed away at 93, leaving the house and its 10 acres to me, I was heartbroken, but also grateful. My husband, Mark, and I were looking to escape the city, and this felt like a gift from her, a sign. The house was old, built by my great-great-grandfather, and it needed work. But the bones were good. We spent the first few weeks just cleaning, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated possessions. It was in the back of the pantry, behind dusty jars of canned peaches and pickled okra, that I found it, her recipe box. It was a simple, dark-stained wooden box worn smooth with age. I smiled when I opened it. Inside were dozens of handwritten cards, the ink faded to a soft brown. Addie's famous apple pie, butter bean casserole, sour cream pound cake. It was a map of my childhood, of every holiday and family gathering. But as I thumbed towards the back, the cards changed. The handwriting was the same, still my grandma's familiar, spidery script, but the titles were different. They weren't for food. One card was titled, "A poultice to keep a man from wandering." The ingredients listed weren't flour and sugar. They were yarrow, a lock of the man's hair, rainwater collected in a hollow stump, and something called heart root, which I'd never heard of. Another was called a tea for a quiet sleep. It called for chamomile and lavender, but also for nightshade and a single, dried teardrop. I felt a little chill run down my spine. It was just old mountain superstition, of course. Folk remedies. Grandma Addie was a product of her time and place. I chuckled, showed Mark, and we had a laugh about hillbilly voodoo. We put the strange cards in a drawer, and I kept the food recipes on the counter, excited to try and replicate her famous pound cake. Mark and we were having a tough time. Nothing dramatic, just the slow, quiet drifting apart that can happen after a decade together. He was distant, always on his phone, working late. Moving to the farm was a last-ditch effort, and for the first few weeks, it didn't seem to be working. He was restless, complaining about the bad cell service, already talking about projects back in the city. Then I baked the pound cake. I followed her recipe to the letter. As I was mixing the batter, I noticed a tiny, faint symbol drawn on the bottom of the recipe card. It looked like two circles intertwined. I didn't think anything of it. I found the same symbol, carved almost invisibly into the wooden spoon I was using. Again, I dismissed it. Quaint, I thought. The cake was incredible. Mark ate 3 slices, and that night, something shifted. He put his phone away. He held my hand on the porch swing. He looked at me. I mean, really looked at me, for the first time in months. "I'm so glad we did this, babe," he said, his voice full of a warmth I hadn't heard in years. "I feel home." I was thrilled. It was working. The country air, the simple living. It was healing us. The next week, I made her butterbean casserole. Again, I found the little symbol on the card. This time, I looked for it. And I found it again, faintly etched into the bottom of the old ceramic casserole dish. That week, Mark, who had always hated yard work, spent 2 entire days clearing brush from the edge of our property, whistling while he worked. He started talking about planting a garden, about fixing the old barn. His restlessness had completely vanished. It was replaced by a deep, almost fervent devotion to the farm. To me, it should have made me happy. And it did, at first. But a quiet unease was starting to grow in my gut. His affection was becoming intense. He didn't like it when I drove into town for supplies. "I can get that for you," he'd insist. "You stay here, where it's safe." He started calling me Addie by accident, catching himself and laughing it off. But it happened more and more often. The tipping point came when I found one of his expensive work shirts, one he was supposed to have sent to the dry cleaners, buried in the garden. It was tied in a knot around a gnarled-looking root. Heart root. The name from the recipe card flashed in my mind. That night, my blood ran cold. I went back to the drawer where we'd put the strange recipes. I pulled out the card, a poultice to keep a man from wandering. I compared the handwriting to the pound cake recipe. It was identical. My grandmother hadn't just been collecting folk magic, she'd been using it. I started searching the house, really looking this time, and I saw them everywhere. The intertwined circles, carved into the bottom of the rocking chair on the porch, scratched into the headboard of the bed, faintly visible under a coat of paint on the kitchen doorway. This house wasn't just built with wood and nails. It was built with intentions, with spells. My sweet, gentle grandma, she had bound my grandfather to this place, to her. And now, by using her recipes, in her kitchen with her tools, I was doing the same thing to Mark. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't love blooming again. It was a cage slowly being built around my husband, a cage I was building. I wanted to stop, but I was terrified. What would happen if I did? The magic, if that's what it was, had fixed things. It had given me the attentive, loving husband I'd been mourning for years. Was I strong enough to let that go? To risk him drifting away again? I decided to test it. One week, I cooked only from my own modern cookbooks. The change was subtle at first, then chillingly fast. By Wednesday, Mark was restless again. By Friday, he was on his phone arguing with his boss, talking about a critical project he needed to get back to. He barely looked at me. He called me by my own name. It was like the fog had lifted, and the man underneath was a stranger again. On Saturday morning, he came into the kitchen while I was having coffee. "Listen, honey," he started, his tone cautious. "This has been great, but I think it's time we start thinking about selling. This quiet life, it's not really us, is it?" Panic clawed at my throat. I heard my own voice, sounding eerily like my grandmother's, say, "Don't be silly, dear. You're just tired. Let me bake you a pie." My grandma's famous apple pie. I went to the recipe box. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the card, and there it was at the bottom, the little symbol of 2 intertwined circles. I looked at Mark. He was staring out the window, his back to me, already a million miles away. I looked down at the recipe: flour, sugar, apples, cinnamon, and at the very end, in faint pencil, almost erased, 1 sliver of your own fingernail, finely ground. I stood there for a long time, the recipe card in my hand, the silence of the old house pressing in on me. The house my grandmother had built not just to live in, but to keep love in, whether it wanted to stay or not. I thought about my grandfather, a quiet man who rarely left the farm and always looked at my grandmother with utter devotion. Had it been devotion, or had it been a spell, baked into every meal he ever ate? Mark was still at the window, talking about RA and real estate agents. I looked at the pantry, at the jars of food my grandmother had canned, each lid likely sealed with more than just heat. I looked at my own hands. I don't remember making a conscious decision. I just remember opening a drawer, taking out a nail file, and beginning the first step of the recipe, because the thought of being alone in that quiet, empty house was so much scarier than whatever it was I was about to do. I'm still here. We're still here. And Mark has never been happier. He never leaves the farm now. He says there's no reason to. Everything he could ever want is right here. My girlfriend Chloe and I were wanderers. We worked odd jobs, saved up, traveled, and repeated the cycle. So when we saw an ad for caretakers on a massive, isolated farm estate in rural England, it felt perfect. 6 months of quiet country living, a decent stipend, and a free place to stay. The owner, a wealthy investor named Mr. Alistair Finch, interviewed us over video call. He was brisk and detached, explaining that the property, Blackwood Manor, had been in his family for centuries, but he had no interest in farming it himself. He just needed someone to live in the caretaker's cottage and make sure the place didn't fall into ruin. There was only one strange condition in the contract. He was very specific about it. In the center of the vast, unplanted north field stood a scarecrow. The locals call it the Harvest Man. Finch explained, his tone betraying no emotion. It's a tradition, a landmark. Your only duty regarding that field is to ensure the scarecrow is never moved, damaged, or altered in any way. Just leave it be. We agreed, of course. A weird scarecrow was a small price to pay for a free home in the English countryside. When we arrived, the place was breathtaking. A sprawling, Gothic-looking manor house, which was to remain locked, a cozy stone cottage for us, and hundreds of acres of rolling fields and ancient woods. And there, exactly as described, in the middle of the huge, fallow north field, was the Harvest Man. He was a monstrous thing, easily 8 feet tall, built on a thick, cross-shaped frame of what looked like blackened oak. He was dressed in rotting burlap sacks and a tattered frock coat, and his head was a large, crudely sewn pumpkin that had long since withered and collapsed in on itself, giving it a terrifying, skeletal grin. It was unnerving, but as Finch said, it was just a landmark. The first month was idyllic. We kept the cottage gardens, made minor repairs, and explored the woods. We mostly forgot about the Harvest Man, who just stood his silent vigil in the distance. As summer bled into autumn, however, things started to get strange. It began with the offerings. One morning, I was walking the property line and cut across the north field. As I passed the scarecrow, I noticed something at its base. 3 dead crows laid out in a neat row. I figured it was a fox or some other predator. I cleared them away and didn't think much of it. A week later, there was a dead rabbit, its entrails carefully removed and coiled beside it. Chloe was creeped out. "This is not normal, Ben," she said, her arms crossed tight. "Someone is doing this." We assumed it was local kids playing a prank, trying to spook the new caretakers. We tried to be more vigilant, but we never saw anyone. Yet the offerings continued to appear. A string of field mice tied together by their tails. A perfect, intact snake's skin. It was getting more and more macabre. The real fear began when the Harvest Man started to move. It wasn't anything obvious at first. I'd glance at it from the cottage window and then look away. When I looked back a few minutes later, its head would be tilted at a slightly different angle. Its tattered sleeve would be hanging lower, as if an arm had been repositioned. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, my imagination. But I knew it wasn't. One evening, I was determined to prove I was going crazy. I took a photo of it on my phone from our porch. An hour later, just as dusk was settling, I took another from the exact same spot. I put the two images side by side. My blood went cold. In the first photo, the scarecrow was facing due east, towards the woods. In the second, it had turned its entire torso, maybe 20 degrees, to face our cottage directly. The wind hadn't done that. Chloe saw the pictures and her face went white. "Ben, I want to leave," she whispered. "There's something wrong with this place, with that thing." I was scared, but I was also stubborn. We'd signed a contract. Where would we go? I told her we'd just stay away from the North Field entirely. We'd ignore it. But it didn't want to be ignored. We started hearing noises at night. A soft, rhythmic thudding against the earth outside. It sounded like someone walking with a heavy, uneven limp. We'd raced to the window, but there was never anyone there. Just the silhouette of the harvest man in the moonlight, standing perfectly still. But he always seemed closer, just a few feet closer to the edge of the field than he had been the day before. One night, I was woken by Chloe shaking me, her eyes wide with terror. "Listen," she breathed. I listened. It was the thudding sound again, but it was louder, and it was accompanied by a dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement, or old burlap dragging over dry soil. It was coming from right outside our cottage. I crept to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains. My heart nearly stopped. The harvest man was at the edge of the field, its shape impossibly tall against the night sky. It was no longer on its post. It was standing at the stone wall that separated the field from our garden, its grotesque pumpkin head turned towards our bedroom window. And as I watched, paralyzed with fear, one of its stick and burlap arms slowly lifted, and a long, branch-like finger tapped against the stone wall. Tap, tap, tap. It knew we were watching. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the farthest corner of the cottage, a kitchen knife in my hand, listening. The tapping eventually stopped, and just before dawn, I dared to look again. It was gone. I scanned the field, my heart pounding, and saw it. It was back in its original position, in the very center of the field, standing on its post as if it had never moved. That was it. We were leaving. We didn't care about the contract. We packed our bags in a frantic haze, throwing our belongings into the car. As Chloe started the engine, I took one last look at the house, at the field. My eyes were drawn to the base of the scarecrow. The earth around it looked disturbed. It wasn't flat. It was mounded like a freshly dug grave. And then I remembered the previous caretakers. Finch had mentioned them in passing. An older couple, he'd said. They left rather abruptly. Didn't even say goodbye. He hadn't been lying. They had left abruptly. They just hadn't gone very far. We drove away and never looked back. I emailed Finch, telling him we were breaking the contract due to a family emergency. His reply was a single sentence: "I understand. The position has been filled. I sometimes wonder about the new caretakers. I wonder if they find the offerings at the base of the scarecrow quaint. I wonder if they notice its head tilting when they're not looking. I wonder what they think when they hear the thudding in the night. Because the harvest man isn't just a landmark. It's a guardian. It protects the land. It ensures a good harvest. And when the land lies fallow, it gets hungry. It demands a different kind of offering. It demands caretakers." When my wife Sarah and I bought the old farmhouse in rural Nebraska, we thought we'd found a steal. It was a foreclosure, and the bank was practically giving it away. 2 stories, a big wraparound porch, a huge red barn, all on 50 acres of land that was flat as a tabletop. The place needed a lot of love, but we had more time than money. Our kids, 8-year-old Leo and 6-year-old Maya, were just excited to have room to run. The house had a strange feel to it from the start. Not menacing, just odd. There were quirks in the construction. Hallways that were just a little too narrow. A staircase where the last step was a different height from all the others. But the strangest thing was in the main living room. Against the long, interior wall that connected to the dining room, there was a section of wall, maybe 10 feet wide, that was different. The plaster was smoother, newer looking, and sound didn't travel right in that spot. If you stood in the middle of the room and talked, your voice was normal. But if you took 2 steps to the left, towards that wall, your voice would suddenly become flat and dead, like you were speaking into a pillow. We called it the deaf spot. The kids noticed it immediately. Maya, in her 6-year-old way, gave it a better name. She called it the hollow place. "Daddy, the hollow place is quiet," she'd say, standing in the deaf spot and whispering, though her whispers were completely inaudible to us just a few feet away. We thought it was a charming quirk, maybe a botched repair job by the previous owners, who, according to the realtor, had left in a hurry. We planned to tear down that wall eventually anyway, to create a more open-plan living space. The first truly unsettling thing happened about a month after we moved in. Leo, our son, started having nightmares. He'd wake up screaming, talking about a crooked man who watches him from the corner of his room. Standard childhood night terrors, we thought. But then he started sleepwalking. We'd find him standing in the living room, facing the hollow place, just standing there, motionless, staring at the blank wall. When we'd gently guide him back to bed, he'd be freezing cold to the touch, even on warm nights. Then Sarah and I started experiencing things. We'd lose time. I'd be in the kitchen making coffee, and the next thing I knew, it would be 20 minutes later, the coffee cold in the pot, and I'd have no memory of the intervening time. Sarah had it happen while she was reading in the living room. She looked up from her book, and the sun was setting. She'd lost 2 hours. It felt like blinking and finding the world had jumped forward without you. The feelings of being watched became constant. A prickling on the back of your neck. The sense of a presence just on the edge of your vision. It was always strongest in the living room, near that strange section of wall. One evening, Sarah and I were watching a movie. The kids were asleep upstairs. Halfway through the film, Maya let out a terrified scream from her bedroom. We bolted up the stairs and found her sitting bolt upright in bed, pointing a trembling finger at her open doorway. "The Whisper Lady was here," she cried. She was leaning in the door. "What did she say, sweetie?" Sarah asked, stroking her hair. Maya's face crumpled in confusion. She didn't say words. She said what it feels like to be cold. In my head, I can't explain the chill that went through me. It wasn't a story a 6-year-old would make up. She said what it feels like to be cold. After that, we started hearing it. Whispers. Faint and indistinct, like a radio playing in another room. But they always came from the same place, the hollow place. The section of wall that swallowed sound. It was impossible, a paradox. How could a place that deadened sound also be the source of it? I became obsessed. I'd press my ear against the smooth plaster, trying to make out the words. It was useless. All I could feel was a faint, almost subsonic vibration, and a strange, deep cold that seemed to radiate from the wall itself. The breaking point was the drawing. Maya was a prolific artist. She drew our family, the house, our dog. But one day, I found a drawing she had hidden under her bed. It was a picture of our family in the living room. Me, Sarah, Leo. But there were other figures in the room with us. They were tall and distorted, with long limbs and faces that were just smudges of gray crayon. They were all standing with their backs to us, facing the hollow place. And at the bottom, Maya had drawn herself, hiding under the coffee table. Underneath the drawing, she had written one word, waiting. That night, I told Sarah, "I'm tearing down that wall. Tomorrow." I didn't wait. I couldn't. After she and the kids were asleep, I went downstairs with a sledgehammer and a crowbar. My heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. I had to know what was in there. I stood in front of the hollow place. The silence it projected felt heavier than ever, hungry. I took a deep breath and swung the sledgehammer. The plaster exploded inwards with a sickeningly soft thump. Not the crash of lath and plaster I expected. A dark hole gaped in the wall. A smell rolled out of it. A smell of damp earth, of cellar rot, and something else, of something metallic and old. I shone my flashlight into the hole. It wasn't a wall cavity filled with insulation. It was a space, a narrow, man-sized gap between the living room wall and what must have been the original dining room wall. The previous owners hadn't knocked a wall down. They had built a new one in front of it. They had sealed something off. My light played over the old wall inside. It was covered in dark, frantic scribbles. Words, symbols, looping patterns, all drawn in what looked like charcoal. But as my light moved lower, I saw it wasn't charcoal. It was a dark, reddish brown, and at the bottom of the narrow space, sitting on the floorboards, was an old, wooden chair. That's all. Just a simple, straight-back chair facing the wall. It made no sense. Why seal up a wall just to hide an empty chair? I felt a wave of anticlimax, of foolishness. And then, my flashlight beam caught something. A slight indentation in the wooden seat of the chair. A slight darkening of the wood on the backrest, right where a head would lean. This chair hadn't just been stored in here. Someone had sat in this chair. For a very, very long time. Suddenly I understood. The cold. The whispers that weren't words but feelings. The lost time. The house wasn't haunted by someone who had died here. It was haunted by someone who had lived here. In the dark. In the silence. They hadn't sealed a thing in. They had sealed a person in. A person who sat in that chair. In that hollow place between the walls, slowly going mad. Projecting their misery, their cold, their loneliness out into the house. The crooked man Leo saw. The whisper Lady Maya heard, they were echoes. Psychic impressions left behind by a desperate, trapped mind. I stumbled back from the wall, my skin crawling. I felt a sudden, dizzying wave of vertigo. For a split second, the living room flickered. The furniture was gone, the air was thick with dust, and I could feel it. An overwhelming, crushing despair. The feeling of sitting in the dark, listening to a family live their lives just a few feet away. A family that wasn't yours in a house that used to be. The feeling of being forgotten, of becoming hollow. I don't know who they walled up in there, or why. The bank had no records of the family before the last one, the one that left in a hurry. But I know they were the ones who built the new wall. Not to keep something in, but maybe, in some misguided way, to give it peace. To give it a quiet place. We left. We packed what we could fit in the car that night, and we drove to a hotel. We never went back. We let the bank take the house again. Let it become someone else's steal. Sometimes I think about that chair, sitting in the dark. I don't think what's in that house is a ghost. A ghost is an ending. What's in that house is a continuation. A long, patient, cold waiting. And it's still there, in the hollow place, listening. My family moved out to that farm in western New South Wales during the worst drought in a generation. The land was parched, the color of rust. Dust was a currency. Dad got the place for a song. 100 acres of nothing and a rundown homestead. But it had one thing that made it worth more than gold. A well. It was ancient, lined with mossy stones, covered by a heavy iron lid. The previous owner, a weathered old bloke named Eamon, showed it to us. He cranked the bucket up, and it came up brimming with water so clear and cold it hurt your teeth. Never run dry, Eamon had said, his eyes distant. Not once. She's a good well. You look after her, she'll look after you. He sold the farm and moved to the coast the next day. Said he was sick of the dust, wanted to see some blue for a change. I was 15 at the time, and I hated it. I missed my friends, the city, everything. But even I had to admit, that water was something else. In a land where every other farmer was trucking in water at a fortune, we had an endless supply of the best tasting water I'd ever had. It was crisp and clean, with a strange, almost sweet mineral tang to it. We drank it, we showered in it, we watered the sad little vegetable patch Mum was trying to grow. The changes were slow at first. We chalked them up to the country lifestyle. We all started sleeping more deeply. We had more energy, even in the blistering heat. Dad, who'd had a bad back for years, said he'd never felt better. Mum's migraines disappeared. We were thriving while everyone around us was struggling. We were lucky. The first hint that something was wrong was our sensitivity to the sun. The Australian sun is fierce, but this was different. It felt personal, aggressive. Being outside during the day became physically painful. Our skin would burn in minutes. Our eyes ached. We found ourselves becoming nocturnal, getting our chores done in the gray light of dawn and dusk, spending the heat of the day inside the cool, dark farmhouse with the curtains drawn. Then came the thirst. It was insatiable. We'd drink glass after glass of the well water, but it never seemed to be enough. It was the only thing that tasted right. Bottled water, which we bought in town for emergencies, tasted foul, like chemicals and plastic. Even the rainwater we collected in a tank tasted flat and dead. Only the well water could slake the deep, persistent thirst that had settled into our bones. I started noticing changes in Mum and Dad. Their skin, which should have been tanned from the sun, was growing pale, almost translucent. Their eyes seemed larger, their pupils permanently dilated. They'd spend hours at night just sitting on the porch, staring out at the darkness in the direction of the well. They rarely spoke. They'd just sit, and sometimes I'd see their heads twitch in unison, as if listening to a sound I couldn't hear. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange sound, a rhythmic, scraping noise. I looked out my bedroom window. The moon was full, casting a pale, milky light over the yard, and I saw them. Mum and Dad. They were kneeling in Mum's vegetable patch, digging in the dry dirt with their bare hands. Not like they were gardening. They were digging frantically, like animals, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their heads were bowed low, their pale hair hanging down. They didn't seem to notice me at all. I watched, my blood turning to ice, for almost an hour. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they both stopped. They stood up, brushed the dirt from their hands, and walked back into the house without a word to each other. The next morning, they acted as if nothing had happened. When I asked about the disturbed soil in the garden, Mum just smiled a vague, placid smile and said she must have been weeding in her sleep. I started to get scared. I tried to ration my intake of the well water, secretly drinking from the rainwater tank, forcing it down despite its dead taste. It didn't help. The thirst was a physical ache. My body craved the well water. My skin was getting paler, my eyes more sensitive to the light. I was changing, just like them. I decided to investigate the well. I knew Dad kept the key to the heavy padlock on the lid on a hook in the shed. One afternoon, when they were both inside in the darkened house, in their strange, silent stupor, I snuck out. The heat was excruciating, like a physical weight, but I forced myself to run to the shed, grab the key, and then to the well. The iron lid was heavy, groaning in protest as I unlocked it and heaved it open. I peered down into the darkness. The water was about 30 feet down, a perfect black circle reflecting the bright, painful sky. It looked normal. I was about to close it when I saw something. A flicker of movement at the edge of the stone lining, just below the water line. I leaned closer, my eyes struggling to adjust. And then I saw them. They were pale, worm-like things, clinging to the wet stones. Hundreds of them. They were thin and translucent, each about the length of my finger, pulsing with a faint, internal bioluminescence. They weren't insects or larvae. They were something else. And as I watched, one of them detached from the stone and wriggled into the water, dissolving almost instantly, turning the water around it milky for a second before it cleared. My stomach churned. This was what was in the water. This was what we were drinking. I slammed the lid shut, locked it, and ran back to the house, my mind screaming. What were those things? And what were they doing to us? That night, the answer came to me in a dream. It wasn't a normal dream. It was vivid, clear. I dreamt I was floating in the cold, black water of the well. I could breathe. The thirst was gone, replaced by a feeling of profound peace, of belonging. I could feel the life in the water around me, the pulsing of the little white things. They weren't just life, they were a consciousness, a hive mind. They were ancient, and the water was their blood. They didn't want to hurt us. They wanted to change us, to make us like them, creatures of the dark and the damp, guardians of the well. I saw Eamon, the old farmer. I saw him not leaving for the coast, but walking into the night, his skin pale, drawn by a thirst he could no longer ignore, towards the deep, dark places of the earth. I saw generations of farmers before him. They never left the farm. They just went to ground. I woke up gasping, my pajamas soaked in sweat. The thirst was overwhelming, a fire in my throat. I knew with a certainty that terrified me, that if I took one more drink of that water, I would be lost forever. I would join my parents, digging in the dirt at night, listening for the call of the well, until one day I wouldn't come back inside at all. I had to leave. Now, I scribbled a note I knew they wouldn't understand. Gone to the city. Don't follow. I packed a bag, emptied my money box, and grabbed every bottle of water from the emergency stash. I snuck out of the house. Mum and Dad were on the porch, sitting in their usual chairs, staring out into the night. They didn't turn as I passed. I don't think they even knew I was there. They were listening to something else now. I ran. I ran down the long dirt driveway, the taste of dust and fear in my mouth. I didn't look back until I hit the main road. In the distance, I could see the silhouette of the farmhouse, a single dim light burning in the window, a tombstone marking the grave of my family. I got a ride with a trucker heading to Sydney. I haven't spoken to my parents since. The police went out there once, after I called them from a payphone, babbling some story about them being sick. They reported back that the couple was eccentric and reclusive but seemed fine. They had plenty of food and water. I know they're not fine. They're just changing, evolving. I live in a basement apartment now where the sun can't get to me. I'm always thirsty. Every time I drink clean, filtered city water, it tastes like poison, and a part of my brain, a deep, primal part, screams for the cold, sweet water from home. It's a scream I have to fight every single day, because I know what the well wants. It looked after us. It made us stronger. And now, it's calling its children home.